First off, I'd just like to say it's a real honor to be part of the group, and I appreciate it very much, and it's fantastic to be able to present to you guys today. And I will immediately follow that by apologizing for the fact that on short notice I wasn't able to put together an audio-visual presentation, so I just brought the guns instead. These will be, have been, and will be in the display room afterwards, so if you're interested in taking a look at any of what I'm going to talk about, they'll all be there for you to take a look at. So what I figured I would talk about today is the development of repeating rifles in French military service. The guns that the French had that are more commonly recognized are the Gras in 1874, which is the first cartridge-firing infantry rifle that the French adopted. It's essentially just a chassepot with a self-contained metallic cartridge. And then everyone knows about the Lebel that came in 1886. But there was actually a series, a progression of 3 intermediary repeating rifles that really fill the gap between a single shot, very simple rifle, and the Lebel, which really was a transformative advance in modern military technology. The smokeless powder of the Lebel made it fundamentally different and fundamentally more effective than anything else that was available anywhere in the world at the time. But there were a bunch of steps to get from one to the other. So the first rifle we're going to start with is the one on top here, which is a model of 1878 Marine Kropatschek. Now, the French Army adopts the Gras and its metallic cartridge in 1874, having realized that, yeah, the metallic cartridge is actually a good idea. It was only 8 years earlier they'd been working with paper cartridges, largely on a number of ideas, but one of the more significant ones was that metallic cartridges are hard to make. In the 1860s, yes, they're cutting-edge technology and they offer a lot of advantages, but how many factories do we have in France that can make them? What's the scrap rate? What does it cost to make these metallic cartridges? What happens if we get our army out in the field and we run out of metallic cartridges? Well, if we have a paper cartridge, we can make it. It's not that difficult in the field to manufacture paper cartridges, but you're not going to do that with a metal cartridge. And that's some of the idea that led to the use of the paper cartridge in the chassepot. Well, after they get thoroughly trounced by the Prussians in 1870, the French Army adopts a metallic cartridge. The Navy does not. The Navy sticks with the chassepot for another 4 years because, well, ultimately, the Navy is looking for a repeating rifle. The Navy is in this position where they are much more likely to have an outnumbered force that needs more firepower than the Army does. The Army has a number of reasons for not wanting a repeating rifle, which I'll get to in a moment. But for the Navy, maximizing the amount of firepower for an individual trooper really has benefits. And so the Navy, circa 1878, looks at a couple of different options, in particular of interest to this group. They actually consider the Winchester Hotchkiss, and they consider the Kropatschek system out of Austria, and they end up adopting the Kropatschek. The Kropatschek is a tube magazine system developed by Alfred von Kropatschek. It was I would describe it as a pretty advanced cutting-edge system for its time, but only for really a pretty brief period. The French would be the first to adopt the Kropatschek. The Austrians only used it in a couple of very small applications. They had a marine rifle that they used and a gendarmerie carbine that used it. However, the system would be adopted by the Portuguese. That's most of the Kropatscheks that we have accessible to us are Portuguese, 1886s. And the Japanese would use the Kropatschek system in the Type 22 Murata. So it's not strictly only the French that were using this tube magazine system. This predates both the Mannlicher and the Mauser clips. And there weren't a lot of really other good repeating magazine systems at that point. So the Navy adopts the Kropatschek, and this is a rare example of a French military firearm that's not actually made in France. They just buy them from OEWG, the Verndl factory in Steyr, Austria. And in 1878, they placed an order for 25,000 of them. They're all in the white, as that one is. And they're all delivered by 1883. 1881. They've all been delivered. And the Navy starts using these. And within a couple of years, the French Army is reconsidering some of its objections to repeating rifles. I mean, the Navy's got this thing. It seems to be working pretty well. They're deploying it primarily down in Indochina, in the French colonies, also in some areas in Africa where the French are active. And it's not leading to any catastrophic defeats of the Army's colonial troops. The French Army had considered some of the traditional objections to repeating rifles, like they're expensive because they're more complicated, the ammunition is expensive, we have to supply a whole lot more ammunition, these guys are just going to go crazy and shoot all their ammunition very quickly and then they're going to run out. And one of the other interesting objections that I hear people discuss less is this idea that what's the point of having rapid fire black powder cartridge rifles? Because if you have your infantry company fire off 3 volleys as fast as they can, they've now created their own smoke screen and they can't see anything. What's the point of letting them fire that fast if they're just going to block their own view of their targets? Let's stick with the single shots. They're cheaper and they're just as effective. Well, they reconsider this. And in 1883, the French ordnance put together a committee to investigate repeating rifles. And this committee would actually run into the late 1880s. They would continue investigating repeating 11 millimeter black powder rifles years after the adoption of the Lebel. And kind of like, we've seen a lot of the experimental guns that the US looked at with all sorts of just fantastically creative and non-functional magazine systems. The French did the same thing. There were at least 3 or 4 dozen different magazine styles that they investigated. The one that they ended up choosing to adopt, again, kind of typical of French ordnance, is essentially just a copy of the Marine Kropatschek. The head of the tool room at the Châtellerault Arsenal, a guy named Albert Close, developed a mildly improved version of Steyer's Kropatschek rifle. And that was developed in 1883, and it was formally adopted by the French Army in 1884 as their first repeating rifle, and that's this guy. He made a couple of improvements to Steyer's design, or to Kropatschek's design. He added a cleaning rod to the side of the action. This is, if you have a repeating black powder rifle, being able to clean it readily and easily is a valuable thing. The Navy rifle did not have that. He extended the magazine capacity by 1. You can see that there's a protrusion out the front of the stock here. The 1878 will hold 7 cartridges, and I should have mentioned it. This is 11 millimeter Gras, 11 by 59 rimmed. The 1884 holds 8 cartridges, so slightly more capacity, but generally speaking, it's just a copy of the Kropatschek. French ordnance really kind of liked doing trials of things, rejecting all the trials rifles, and then just taking the best ideas and making the best thing themselves, and then not having to pay anyone royalties. It's right about this time in 1884 that Paul Vier, a French chemist, is developing smokeless powder. Chemistry across Europe has been searching for the right formulation, the right way to do a smokeless powder. It's not like it was an unexpected discovery on the part of Vier. It was a matter of finding just the right formulation so that your powder is consistent and it is volatile enough that you can easily fire it, but not so volatile that it goes off unexpectedly. You need to get the burn rate low enough that it doesn't just detonate and have very high pressure, but fast enough that it will be more useful than black powder. And so once the 1884 is adopted, the French Army continues to work on rifle development, but they acknowledge that what they're doing is really a short-term stand-in. Technology is advancing very quickly in the mid-1880s, and they recognize this, and they're not really entirely sure what the best long-term solution is going to be, but the Germans have adopted a tube-fed rifle in the Mauser 71-84. This is part of what prompts the 1884 to be adopted by the French. We cannot let the Germans get ahead of us technologically. And there is also a desire to be able to update and continue to use those old Gras rifles. They've got several million of them in inventory. And the French have, for a very long time, had a great interest in converting and updating their rifles. And so this tube-fed thing is cool in the 1884, but it's also expensive. And the idea of developing the 1885, which is this guy, is let's figure out a way that we can convert existing Gras rifles into tube-fed Kropatschek systems. And you would think of, like, looking at that 1885, what on earth could you possibly salvage from an 1870s single-shot rifle? Well, actually a fair amount. They were able to cut the cost of that 1885 in half by salvaging components from a Gras rifle to do it. And in fact, there was significantly more production of conversions of the 1885 from Gras than there was of new production rifles. So you can save and reuse the barrel, which is a tremendously expensive part. You don't have to go through any of the rifling process. You can save and reuse the stock and a couple other small parts. And that's about it, but that's enough to make it worthwhile. But you have to make a number of changes if you're going to go from this to, if you're going to convert a Gras into something like this. Well, you can simplify this a lot by replacing the center of the splitting the stock in two. There was a change in the magazine cutoff. You can't see it up on these two. We can take a look after the talk when we open them up. The magazine cutoff is actually nested under the bolt handle. And so, actually I can show some of this. There are these two distinctive holes in the bottom of the bolt handle, and those are recesses to allow the magazine cutoff lever to sit in either open or closed position when the bolt's closed. Well, if you're going to have that, that's a lot of work to try and convert a Gras bolt. If, however, we move the magazine cutoff to the bottom, now we can actually reuse a bunch of the bolt components as well and save further money in converting these rifles. By splitting the stock apart, you're actually strengthening the gun. There's not that much wood right in here on either of these designs, and splitting it in half makes the gun fundamentally quite a bit stronger. So, I walk gently so I don't knock that over. Total production, we are looking at about 86,000 Model 1884s, so not huge by European Army standards, but not trivial. For the 1885s, it's more like 50,000 rifles, because they knew this would be a short-term, sort of a transitional rifle, perhaps just in a way we're eventually going to adopt something else that's going to be probably better, but this gives us a way to upgrade all those Gras into something that we can still use. Even if it's just, for the reserve in case of mobilization, we'll have 3 million magazine rifles instead of 3 million single shots. So in total, they only managed to make about 16 or 18,000 brand new 1885s and only about 33,000 conversions of Gras. Before all of a sudden this smokeless powder is here. And you're not really so much converting a black powder single shot into a smokeless powder repeater. Now, once smokeless powder becomes accessible, it is a tremendously important state secret, and they treat it as such, and they start doing the work to develop the next generation of rifle. And they do this right at the beginning. And that is to say that they start by investigating a new cartridge. They realize that the new powder is going to allow much higher velocities. It's going to be much more suitable to a small bore rifle. And a committee is set up to investigate the new cartridge and to pick a new cartridge. And they get partway through their investigation. They are able to spend a lot of time experimenting with bore diameter. They look at 6, or 7, 7.5, they look at 8 millimeter, and they decide by late 1885 that, okay, it's 8 millimeter is going to give us, we think, the most ballistically effective bullet. Now, we can move on to the next things, which would be develop the case and pick an action. And they're looking at the Remington Lee, which would have been a very modern system at the time. Obviously, we see that the British used the Remington Lee system for decades and decades. They are also looking at the Mannlicher system with its packet loading. And then everything gets a wrench gets thrown right into the middle of the works at the very beginning of 1886 when a new war minister is appointed, a guy named General Boulanger. And he recognizes the significance of this smokeless powder, and he wants it now. Like, we need to have this equipment before the Germans get wind of it. Other chemists are going to figure this out, and in fact they do. It's kind of like nuclear technology in the 40s and 50s. It does not take that long before everyone else figures out how it's done, either through engineering or espionage. Same thing with smokeless powder. And Boulanger wants this advantage now. He wants the rifle now. He wants to have it built so that if there is a war with Germany, the entire French army is equipped with this fundamentally superior weapon. And he demands, in January of 1886, that the prototype new rifle must be on his desk May 1st, 1886. So he gives the design team 5 months And they're at the point of they have picked a bullet diameter. All we have left is, the whole action in the cartridge, and we've got 5 months to do it. So they do the only thing that they can do, which is convert a rifle that's already in inventory. And what they've got is that guy. They've got, and in fact, you can see a tremendous similarity between the 1885 and the prototype of the Lebel. And they know they're going to go to 8mm. They know they're going to use smokeless powder. And so the question is, what is the fastest, effectively, the fastest way that we can convert that black powder tube-fed magazine to this new technology? And so it's really a very remarkable piece of development work because they do it. They have the prototype Lebel finished and ready, not in production, obviously, and it hasn't gone through trials, but they have the design done on deadline, which is actually even more remarkable for it being a French project. There is a whole team of French ordnance officers who split out the design tasks. There are a number of guys at the Châtellerault Arsenal. Albert Close, who originally developed the 1884, he and an engineer named Louis Vidu, they modify the action to fit a new shape of cartridge. There's a Colonel Bonnet who designs a 2-lug rotating bolt. The previous 3 rifles, the Kropatschek system, just use the stem of the bolt handle as a single locking lug. That's perfectly adequate for black powder. It's very common. That's what basically everyone did. But that's not going to sustain smokeless powder. We're looking at, went from, I think, 28,000 PSI in the black powder cartridge to 40,000 PSI in the smokeless powder cartridge. So Bonnet designs a 2-lug rotating bolt. Captain Desalot designs the cartridge. And what he essentially does is take the Gras cartridge and give it this somewhat interesting double taper that necks down 11mm to 8mm. And he does so in a way that when the cartridges are laying flat in a row, this is a place where I really ought to have a picture, the tips of these pointed new bullets are not lined up with the primers of the rounds in front of them. One of the fundamental dangers of a tube-fed magazine design, and we see trials reports in other countries where tube magazine guns are abandoned because every once in a while, the magazine detonates itself under recoil. Well, with the new 8mm cartridge, the bullet tips simply don't line up with the primers in front of them, and that makes the system safe. They will later modify the cartridge case head to make it even safer, but they don't really need to at first. So Desalot designs the case. Interestingly, Colonel Lebel, whose name has been associated with this rifle, his specific contribution was designing the bullet jacket. He also ran one of the French Camp de Chalon, which was one of the testing grounds. The head of the rifle development committee was a guy named General Tremond, and the rifle is early on referred to as the Tremond Lebel, presumably because of the trials facility being run by Lebel. Eventually, they dropped Tremond's name, and Lebel had a part in this, but he really doesn't actually deserve to have his name as the defining name of the rifle. There's some thought that it may have something to do with the fact that if you just look at the homonym, Lebel in France means like the beautiful one or the good one. Well, this is a fantastically potent military rifle in 1886 when it's adopted. Anyway, a little bit of an aside there. The French formally adopt this rifle in April of 1887 and set about putting it into production. By 1894, they will produce some 3 million of them, which is enough to fully arm the entire reserve army. And they actually stop production basically in the mid-1890s. And it's those rifles that will eventually serve in World War I. Unfortunately, as a result of, so Boulanger got his way. The French were able to very quickly design, produce, and equip a fundamentally new rifle. However, because they rushed the process, they ended up with a rifle that was basically obsolete 2 years after it was adopted. 1889, we get the first really modern Mausers. They have single stack magazines, but they're clip fed, and they are basically in every way superior rifles to the Lebel here. By that time, the Germans have smokeless powder, and the French, by rushing this process, have really kind of saddled themselves with an out-of-date rifle. And then they have 3 million of them, so they're kind of stuck with them. They're not in a position to be able to just throw them away and design something new. But once World War I rolls around and they start losing rifles in battle, they will in fact transition to a newer system that's more modern and cheaper and easier to manufacture. I do also want to touch briefly on the fate of these three patterns of Kropatschek rifles. They're all very scarce in the United States. They're actually very scarce everywhere. There were 122,000 of them, if you combine all three patterns, that were still in French inventory at the beginning of World War I. At the very beginning, they used them to equip a variety of people who are very unlikely to see combat. They equip some of the territorials in Madagascar with them. They equip some of the more ceremonial troops in Paris with them. And all this frees up Lebel rifles to go to the front, where they're being very quickly used up by modern warfare. Within a couple of years, production has started on the Berthier. And the 11mm rifles are really and truly obsolete. And so the French then basically give them all to Russia as military aid. The Russians will use some of them. There's actually a great picture I have in my book of two Russian soldiers with 1885 French Kropatscheks in uniform and everything in World War I. But they're obsolete rifles still. So it's better than having nothing, which is the situation a lot of Russian soldiers were in World War I. The Russians will, at the end of the war, the Russians have a lot of miscellaneous arms still lying about. A lot of these rifles get destroyed through Russian use. Those that don't are essentially packed away in arsenals, and in the 1930s, they are subsequently given to the Spanish during the Spanish Civil War as military aid to the Republican, communist, anarchist side of the Spanish Civil War. Now they're really, really obsolete. They get some use in the Spanish Civil War. At the end of that war, they are once again packed away by Franco into armories, and Interarms buys out the Spanish arsenals, Spanish armories in the 1950s, and brings into the US all sorts of interesting stuff. I'm sure you guys have seen some of the 1895 Winchester muskets that went to Russia and then Spain and then the US. Well, that's exactly the same situation for many, if not most, of the French Kropatscheks that are in the US today. Some of them will actually be found with a Made in France stamp that was the required import mark in the 50s when they came into the US. So that is perhaps a little more concise of a talk than the previous ones. Hopefully it was of some interest to you. Any questions that I can answer on the subject? Yes?
Did they make this in a carbine configuration or not?
No, none of these were made as carbines. Although I have a carbine 1878 in the display room, which is a mystery to me, because there's absolutely no record of any French purchase or use of carbines, and yet I have one there that came out of Afghanistan.
Is it a cut-down rifle?
No. It appears to be a factory-made carbine. There was some experimentation by OEWG with carbine-length Kropatscheks. The Portuguese had both short rifle and carbine versions. The Spanish experimented with a Kropatschek carbine, but the French never did. I think it's largely because the 1878s were Marine rifles, they were Navy rifles. The carbines are typically going to be something you'd see go to cavalry, and the Navy didn't have any of that.
But also, wouldn't the carbine not allow the powder to burn through enough to get really the power out of the gun?
It would definitely be a reduced power firing, but the French did have plenty of carbine versions of the Gras.
Yeah, that's true.
So they did use carbines in 11mm Gras. Any other questions? All right, thank you.